England from no period of modern society is so favorable for the study of capitalist accumulation as the period of the last year. It is as if this period had found Fortunatus' purse. But of all countries, England again furnishes the classical example, because it holds the foremost place in the world market, because capitalist production is here alone completely developed, and lastly, because the introduction of the free trade millennium since has cut off the last retreat of vulgar economy. The titanic advance of production, the latter half of the year's period again far surpassing the former, has been already pointed out sufficiently in Part IV. Although the absolute increase of the English population in the last half-century was very great, the relative increase or rate of growth fell constantly, as the following table borrowed from the census showed. Annual increase % of the population of England and Wales in decimal numbers. After these few examples, one understands the cry of triumph of the Registrar General of the British people. Rapidly, as the population has increased, it has not kept pace with the progress of industry and wealth. Let us turn now to the direct agents of this industry, or the producers of this wealth, to the working class. It is one of the most melancholy features in the social state of this country, says Gladstone, that while there was a decrease in the consuming powers of the people, and while there was an increase in the privations and distress of the laboring class and operatives, there was at the same time a constant accumulation of wealth in the upper classes, and a constant increase of capital. Thus spake this unctuous minister in the House of Commons of February 8. On April H, years later, in the speech in which he introduced his budget, from to the taxable income of the country increased by %. In the years from to it had increased from the basis taken in by %. The fact is so astonishing as to be almost incredible. This intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power, entirely confined to classes of property, must be of indirect benefit to the laboring population, because it cheapens the commodities of general consumption. While the rich have been growing richer, the poor have been growing less poor. At any rate, whether the extremes of poverty are less, I do not presume to say. Human life is but, in 9 cases out of 10, a struggle for existence. Professor Fawcett, not bound like Gladstone by official considerations, declares roundly, I do not, of course, deny that money wages have been augmented by this increase of capital, but this apparent advantage is to a great extent lost, because many of the necessaries of life are becoming dearer. The rich grow rapidly richer, whilst there is no perceptible advance in the comfort enjoyed by the industrial classes. They become almost the slaves of the tradesmen, to whom they owe money. But first, one word on official pauperism, or on that part of the working class which has forfeited its condition of existence and vegetates upon public alms. The official list of paupers numbered in England persons in. In consequence of the cotton famine, it grew in the years into the crisis of which fell most heavily on London, created in this center of the world market, more populous than the Kingdom of Scotland, an increase of pauperism for the year of % compared with, and of % compared with, and a still greater increase for the first months of as compared with. From the analysis of the statistics of pauperism, 2 points are to be taken. On the one hand, the fluctuation up and down of the number of paupers reflects the periodic changes of the industrial cycle. On the other, the official statistics become more and more misleading as to the actual extent of pauperism in proportion as, with the accumulation of capital, the class struggle, and therefore, the class consciousness of the working men, develop. The barbarity in the treatment of the paupers, at which the English press have cried out so loudly during the last 2 years, is of ancient date. F. Engels showed in exactly the same horrors, exactly the same trenchant canting outcries of sensational literature. But frightful increase of deaths by starvation in London during the last 10 years proves beyond doubt the growing horror in which the working people hold the slavery of the workhouse, that place of punishment for misery. B. The badly paid strata of the British industrial class during the cotton famine of. Dr. Smith was charged by the Privy Council with an inquiry into the conditions of nourishment of the distressed operatives in Lancashire and Cheshire. His observations during many preceding years had led him to the conclusion that, to avert starvation diseases, the daily food of an average woman ought to contain at least grains of carbon with grains of nitrogen, the daily food of an average man at least grains of carbon with grains of nitrogen. For women, about the same quantity of nutritive elements as are contained in pounds of good wheaten bread, for men divided by more, for the weekly average of adult men and women at least grains of carbon and grains of nitrogen. His calculation was practically confirmed, in a surprising manner, by its agreement with the miserable quantity of nourishment to which one had forced down the consumption of the cotton operative. This was in December, grains of carbon and grains of nitrogen weekly. In the year, the Privy Council ordered an inquiry into the state of distress of the worst nourished part of the English working class. Dr. Simon, medical officer to the Privy Council, chose for this work the above-mentioned Dr. Smith. His inquiry ranges on the one hand over the agricultural laborers, on the other, over silk weavers, needlewomen, kid glovers, stocking weavers, glove weavers, and shoemakers. The latter categories are, with the exception of the stocking weavers, exclusively town dwellers. It was made a rule in the inquiry to select in each category the most healthy families, and those comparatively in the best circumstances. As a general result, it was found that in only one of the examined classes of indoor operatives did the average nitrogen supply just exceed, while in another it nearly reached the estimated standard of bare sufficiency, and that in two classes there was defect in one, a very large defect of both nitrogen and carbon. Moreover, as regards the examined families of the agricultural population, it appeared that more than a fifth were with less than the estimated sufficiency of carbonaceous food, that more than one-third were with less than the estimated sufficiency of nitrogenous food, and that in 3 counties, insufficiency of nitrogenous food was the average local diet. Among the agricultural laborers, those of England, the wealthiest part of the United Kingdom, were the worst fed. The insufficiency of food among the agricultural laborers fell, as a rule, chiefly on the women and children, for the man must eat to do his work. Still greater penury ravaged the town workers examined. They are so ill-fed that assuredly among them there must be many cases of severe and injurious privation. That cases are innumerable in which defective diet is the cause or the aggravator of disease can be affirmed by anyone who is conversant with poor law medical practice, or with the wards and outpatient rooms of hospitals. Yet in this point of view, there is, in my opinion, a very important sanitary context to be added. It must be remembered that privation of food is very reluctantly borne, and that, as a rule, great poorness of diet will only come when other privations have preceded it. Long before insufficiency of diet is a matter of hygienic concern, long before the physiologist would think of counting the grains of nitrogen and carbon which intervene between life and starvation, the household will have been utterly destitute of material comfort, clothing and fuel will have been even scantier than food. Against inclemencies of weather there will have been no adequate protection. Dwelling space will have been stinted to the degree in which overcrowding produces or increases disease. Of household utensils and furniture, there will have been scarcely any even cleanliness will have been found costly or difficult, and if there still be self-respectful endeavors to maintain it, every such endeavor will represent additional pangs of hunger. The home, too, will be where shelter can be cheapest bought, in quarters where commonly there is least fruit of sanitary supervision, least drainage, least scavenging, least suppression of public nuisances, least or worst water supply, and if in town, least light and air. Such are the sanitary dangers to which poverty is almost certainly exposed, when it is poverty enough to imply scantiness of food. And while the sum of them is of terrible magnitude against life, the mere scantiness of food is in itself a very serious moment. These are painful reflections, especially when it is remembered that the poverty to which they advert is not the deserved poverty of idleness. In all cases, it is the poverty of working population. Indeed, as regards the indoor operatives, the work which obtains the scanty pittance of food is for the most part excessively prolonged. Yet evidently it is only in a qualified sense that the work can be deemed self-supporting, and on a very large scale the nominal self-support can be only a circuit, longer or shorter, to pauperism. Speaking generally, it may be said that the evils are uncontrolled in England. By order of the Privy Council, an inquiry was made into the conditions of the housing of the agricultural laborers, of the poorer classes in the towns. The results of the admirable work of Dr. Julian Hunter are to be found in the 7th and 8th reports on public health. To the agricultural laborers I shall come later. On the condition of town dwellings, I quote, as preliminary, a general remark of Dr. Simon. Although my official point of view, he says, is one exclusively physical, common humanity requires that the other aspect of this evil should not be ignored. In its higher degrees, it almost necessarily involves such negation of all delicacy, such unclean confusion of bodies and bodily functions, such exposure of animal and sexual nakedness, as is rather bestial than human. To be subject to these influences is a degradation which must become deeper and deeper for those on whom it continues to work. The children who are born under its curse, it must often be a very baptism into infamy. And beyond all measure hopeless is the wish that persons thus circumstanced should ever in other respects aspire to that atmosphere of civilization, which has its essence in physical and moral cleanliness. London takes the first place in overcrowded habitations, absolutely unfit for human beings. Further, the better-off part of the working class, together with the small shopkeepers and other elements of the lower middle class, falls in London more and more under the curse of these vile conditions of dwelling, in proportion as improvements, and with them the demolition of old streets and houses, advance, as factories and the afflux of human beings grow in the metropolis, and finally as house rents rise with the ground rents. Rents have become so heavy that few laboring men can afford more than one room. There is almost no house property in London that is not overburdened with a number of middlemen. For the price of land in London is always very high in comparison with its yearly revenue, and therefore every buyer speculates on getting rid of it again at a jury price, or on pocketing an extraordinary increase of value arising from the neighborhood of some large establishment. As a consequence of this, there is a regular trade in the purchase of fag-ends of leases. The rents are weekly, and these gentlemen run no risk. In consequence of the making of railroads in the city, the spectacle has lately been seen in the east of London of a number of families wandering about some Saturday night with their scanty worldly goods on their backs, without any resting place but the workhouse. The workhouses are already overcrowded, and the improvements already sanctioned by Parliament are only just begun. If laborers are driven away by the demolition of their old houses, they do not leave their old parish, or at most they settle down on its borders, as near as they can get to it. They try, of course, to remain as near as possible to their workshop. The inhabitants do not go beyond the same or the next parish, parting their two-room tenements into single rooms and crowding even those. Even at an advanced rent, the people who are displaced will hardly be able to get an accommodation so good as the meager one they have left. Half the workmen of the Strand walk 2 miles to their work. This same Strand, a main thoroughfare which gives strangers an imposing idea of the wealth of London, may serve as an example of the packing together of human beings in that town. In one of its parishes, the officer of health reckoned persons per acre, although half the width of the Thames was reckoned in. It will be self-understood that every sanitary measure, which, as has been the case hitherto in London, hunts the laborers from one quarter, by demolishing uninhabitable houses, serves only to crowd them together yet more closely in another. Either, says Dr. Hunter, the whole proceeding will of necessity stop as an absurdity, or the public compassion be effectually aroused to the obligation which may now be without exaggeration called national, of supplying cover to those who by reason of their having no capital, cannot provide it for themselves, though they can by periodical payments reward those who will provide it for them. Admire this capitalistic justice. The owner of land, of houses, the businessman, when expropriated by improvements such as railroads, the building of new streets, and not only receives full indemnity, he must, according to law, human and divine, be comforted for his enforced abstinence, over and above this by a thumping profit. The laborer, with his wife and child and chattels, is thrown out into the street, and if he crowds in too large numbers towards quarters of the town where the vestries insist on decency, he is prosecuted in the name of sanitation. Except London, there was at the beginning of the 8th century no single town in England of inhabitants. Only 5 had more than. Now there are towns with more than inhabitants. The result of this change is not only that the class of town people is enormously increased, but the old close-backed little towns are now centers, built round on every side, open nowhere to air, and being no longer agreeable to the rich are abandoned by them for the pleasanter outskirts. The successors of these rich are occupying the larger houses at the rate of a family to each room, and a population, for which the houses were not intended and quite unfit, has been created, whose surroundings are truly degrading to the adults and ruinous to the children. The more rapidly capital accumulates in an industrial or commercial town, the more rapidly flows the stream of exploitable human material, the more miserable are the improvised dwellings of the laborers. Newcastle-on-Tyne, as the center of a coal and iron district of growing productiveness, takes the next place after London in the housing infern. Not less than persons live there in single room. Because of their absolute danger to the community, houses in great numbers have lately been destroyed by the authorities in Newcastle and Gateshead. The building of new houses progresses very slowly, business very quickly. The town was, therefore, in more full than ever. Scarcely a room was to let. Dr. Embleton, of the Newcastle Fever Hospital, says, "There can be little doubt that the great cause of the continuance and spread of the typhus has been the overcrowding of human beings, and the uncleanliness of their dwelling. Rooms in which laborers in many cases live are situated in confined and unwholesome yards or courts, and for space, light, air, and cleanliness are models of insufficiency and insalubrity, and a disgrace to any civilized community. In them men, women, and children lie at night huddled together, and as regards the men, the night shift succeed the day shift, and the day shift the night shift in unbroken series for some time together, the beds having scarcely time to cool. The whole house badly supplied with water and worse with privies, dirty, unventilated, and pestiferous. The price per week of such lodgings ranges from 2. The town of Newcastle-on-Tyne, says Dr. Hunter, contains a sample of the finest tribe of our countrymen, often sunk by external circumstances of house and street into an almost savage degradation. In one small cellar measuring cubic feet, there are 10 persons. Vincent Street, Green Air Place, and the Lays include houses having inhabitants, beds, and privies. The beds, and in that term I include any roll of dirty old rags, or an armful of shavings, have an average of persons to each. Many have in persons to each, and some people, I am told, are absolutely without beds. They sleep in their ordinary clothes, on the bare boards, young men and women, married and unmarried altogether. I need scarcely add that many of these dwellings are dark, damp, dirty, stinking holes, utterly unfit for human habitations. They are the centers from which disease and death are distributed amongst those in better circumstances, who have allowed them thus to fester in our midst. Bristol takes the 3rd place after London in the misery of its dwelling. Bristol, where the blankest poverty and domestic misery abound in the wealthiest town of Europe. See the nomad population. We turn now to a class of people whose origin is agricultural, but whose occupation is in great part industrial. They are the light infantry of capital, thrown by it, according to its needs, now to this point, now to that. When they are not on the march, they camp. Nomad labor is used for various operations of building and draining, brick-making, lime-burning, railway-making, and a flying column of pestilence. It carries into the places in whose neighborhood it pitches its camp, smallpox, typhus, cholera, scarlet fever, and in undertakings that involve much capital outlay, such as railways, and the contractor himself generally provides his army with wooden huts and the like, thus improvising villages without any sanitary provision. Outside the control of the local boards, very profitable to the contractor, who exploits the laborers in twofold fashion, as soldiers of industry and as tenants. According as the wooden hut contains, or holds, its inhabitant, navvy, or whatever he may be, has to pay or shillings weekly. One example will suffice. In September, Dr. Simon reports that the chairman of the Nuisances Removal Committee of the parish of Sevenoaks sent the following denunciation to Sir George Grey, Home Secretary. The lodging which is obtained by the pitmen and other laborers connected with the collieries of Northumberland and Durham, says Dr. Julian Hunter, is perhaps, on the whole, the worst and the dearest of which any large specimens can be found in England, the similar parishes of Monmouthshire except. The extreme badness is in the high number of men found in one room, in the smallness of the ground plot on which a great number of houses are thrust, the want of water, the absence of privies, and the frequent placing of one house on the top of another, or distribution into flats. The lessee acts as if the whole colony were encamped, not resident. The effect of crises on the best paid part of the working class. Before I turn to the regular agricultural laborers, I may be allowed to show, by one example, how industrial revulsions affect even the best paid, the aristocracy of the working class. It will be remembered that the year brought one of the great crises with which the industrial cycle periodically ends. The next termination of the cycle was due in. Already discounted in the regular factory districts by the cotton famine, which threw much capital from its wonted sphere into the great centers of the money market. The crisis assumed, at this time, an especially financial character. Its outbreak was signalized by the failure of a gigantic London bank, immediately followed by the collapse of countless swindling companies. One of the great London branches of industry involved in the catastrophe was iron shipbuilding. The magnates of this trade had not only overproduced beyond all measure during the overtrading time, but they had, besides, engaged in enormous contracts on the speculation that credit would be forthcoming to an equivalent extent. Now a terrible reaction set in, that even at this hour continues in this and other London industry. To show the condition of the laborers, I quote the following from the circumstantial report of a correspondent of the Morning Star, who, at the end of and beginning of, visited the chief centers of distress, on the after-pains of the crisis of, the following extract from a Tory newspaper. It must not be forgotten that the East End of London, which is here dealt with, is not only the seat of the iron shipbuilding mentioned above, but also of a so-called home industry, always underpaid. A frightful spectacle was to be seen yesterday in one part of the metropolis. Although the unemployed thousands of the East End did not parade with their black flags en masse, the human torrent was imposing enough. Let us remember what these people suffer. They are dying of hunger. That is the simple and terrible fact. There are of them. In our presence in one quarter of this wonderful metropolis are packed, next door to the most enormous accumulation of wealth the world ever saw, cheek by jowl with this, are helpless, starving people. These thousands are now breaking in upon the other quarters, always half-starving. They cry their misery in our ears. They cry to heaven. They tell us from their miserable dwellings that it is impossible for them to find work and useless for them to beg. The local ratepayers themselves are driven by the parochial charges to the verge of pauperism. As it is the fashion amongst English capitalists to quote Belgium as the paradise of the laborer because, or what is the same thing, is there limited neither by the despotism of trades unions, nor by factory acts, a word or two on the of the Belgian laborer. Assuredly, no one was more thoroughly initiated in the mysteries of this happiness than the late M. Ducpéchaux, Inspector General of Belgian prisons and charitable institutions, and member of the Central Commission of Belgian Statistics. Let us take his work Bruxelles. Here we find, among other matters, a normal Belgian laborer's family, whose yearly income and expenditure he calculates on very exact data, and whose conditions of nourishment are then compared with those of the soldier, sailor, and prisoner. The family of these persons, it is assumed that nor are there nor the father and eldest son, however, allow themselves, and on Sundays for which a whole centimes a week are reckoned. From a general compilation of wages allowed to the laborers in different trades, it follows that the highest average of daily wage is franc for men, centimes for women, centimes for boys, and centimes for girls. Calculated at this rate, the resources of the family would amount, at the maximum, 2 francs a year. In the family, taken as typical, we have calculated all possible resources. But in ascribing wages to the mother of the family, we raise the question of the direction of the household. How will its internal economy be cared for? Who will look after the young children? Who will get ready the meals, do the washing and mending? This is the dilemma incessantly presented to the laborer. According to this, the budget of the family is, in fact, in this there follows, on the smallest change in the price of the most essential means of subsistence, a change in the number of deaths and crime. In all Belgium are families of whom, according to the official statistics, are wealthy and on the list of voters equals, persons, families of the lower middle class in towns and villages, the greater part of them constantly sinking into the proletariat, equals, person. Finally, working-class families equals, persons, of whom the model ones enjoy the happiness depicted by Ducpéchaux. Of the working-class families over are on the pauper list. The British agricultural proletariat. Nowhere does the antagonistic character of capitalistic production and accumulation assert itself more brutally than in the progress of English agriculture and the retrogression of the English agricultural laborer. Before I turn to his present situation, a rapid retrospect. Modern agriculture dates in England from the middle of the 8th century, although the revolution in landed property, from which the changed mode of production starts as a basis, has a much earlier date. If we take the statements of Arthur Young, a careful observer, though a superficial thinker, as to the agricultural labor of, the latter plays a very pitiable part compared with his predecessor of the end of the 8th century, when the laborer could live in plenty and accumulate wealth, not to speak of the 8th century, the golden age of the English laborer in town and country. We need not, however, go back so far. In a very instructive work of the year we read, the great farmer is nearly mounted to a level with him, while the poor laborer is depressed almost to the earth. His unfortunate situation will fully appear by taking a comparative view of it. Only 40 years ago, and at present, landlord and tenant have both gone hand in hand in keeping the laborer down. It is then proved in detail that the real agricultural wages between and fell nearly a quarter or %. Modern policy, says Dr. Richard Price also, is indeed more favorable to the higher classes of people, and the consequences may in time prove that the whole kingdom will consist of only gentry and beggars, or of grandees and slaves. Nevertheless, the position of the English agricultural laborer from with regard to his food and dwelling, as well as to his self-respect, amusements, and is an ideal never attained again since that time. His average wage expressed in pints of wheat was from 2 pints in Eden's time only in but. The same state of things went on quietly until the swing riots, revealed to us by the light of blazing cornstacks, that misery and black mutinous discontent smoldered quite as fiercely under the surface of agricultural as of manufacturing England. At this time, Sadler in the House of Commons christened the agricultural laborers white slaves, and a bishop echoed the epithet in the upper house. The most notable political economist of that period, E.G. Wakefield, says, "The peasant of the south of England is not a freeman, nor is he a slave, he is a pauper." The repeal of the Corn Laws gave a marvelous impulse to English agriculture. Drainage on the most extensive scale, new methods of stall feeding and of the artificial cultivation of green crops, introduction of mechanical manuring apparatus, new treatment of clay soils, increased use of mineral manures, employment of the steam engine and of all kinds of new machinery, more intensive cultivation generally, characterized this epoch. Mr. Pusey, chairman of the Royal Agricultural Society, declares that the expenses of farming have been reduced nearly one-half by the introduction of new machinery. On the other hand, the actual return of the soil rose rapidly. Greater outlay of capital per acre, and, as a consequence, more rapid concentration of farms, were essential conditions of the new method. At the same time, the area under cultivation increased from 2 acres, without reckoning the great area in the eastern counties, which was transformed from rabbit warrens and poor pastures into magnificent corn fields. It has already been seen that, at the same time, the total number of persons employed in agriculture fell. As far as the actual agricultural laborers of both sexes and of all ages are concerned, their number fell from to in. The English Registrar General, therefore, rightly remarks, the increase of farmers and farm laborers since bears no kind of proportion to the increase of agricultural produce. But Professor Rogers comes to the conclusion that the lot of the English agricultural labor of today, not to speak of his predecessor in the last half of the H and in the H century, but only compared with his predecessor from 2, has changed for the worse to an extraordinary extent. That the peasant has again become a serf, and a serf worse fed and worse clothed. Dr. Julian Hunter, in his epoch-making report on the dwellings of the agricultural laborers, says, "The cost of the hind is fixed at the lowest possible amount on which he can live. The supplies of wages and shelter are not calculated on the profit to be derived from it. He is a zero in farming calculations, the means being always supposed to be a fixed quantity. As to any further reduction of his income, he may say, nihil habeo nihil curo. He has no fears for the future, because he has now only the spare supply necessary to keep him. He has reached the zero from which are dated the calculations of the farmer. Come what will, he has no share either in prosperity or adversity." In the year, an official inquiry took place into the conditions of nourishment and labor of the criminals condemned to transportation and penal servitude. The results are recorded in 2 voluminous blue books. Among other things, it is said, from an elaborate comparison between the diet of convicts in the convict prisons in England and that of paupers in workhouses and of free laborers in the same country, it certainly appears that the former are much better fed than either of the 2 other classes, whilst the amount of labor required from an ordinary convict under penal servitude is about one-half of what would be done by an ordinary day laborer. A few characteristic depositions of witnesses. John Smith, governor of the Edinburgh prison, deposes, "From the tables appended to the first volume of the report, I have compiled the annexed comparative summary." The general result of the inquiry by the Medical Commission on the food of the lowest fed classes is already known to the reader. He will remember that the diet of a great part of the agricultural laborers' families is below the minimum necessary to arrest starvation diseases. This is especially the case in all the purely rural districts of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Wilts, Stafford, Oxford, Berks, and Herts. "The nourishment obtained by the laborer himself," says Dr. E. Smith, "is larger than the average quantity indicates, since he eats a larger share, necessary to enable him to perform his labor, of food than the other members of the family, including in the poorer districts nearly all the meat and bacon. The quantity of food obtained by the wife and also by the children at the period of rapid growth is in many cases, in almost every county, deficient, and particularly in nitrogen. The male and female servants living with the farmers themselves are sufficiently nourished. Their number fell from to in. The labor of women in the fields," says Dr. Smith, "whatever may be its disadvantages, is under present circumstances of great advantage to the family, since it adds that amount of income which provides shoes and clothing and pays the rent, and thus enables the family to be better fed. One of the most remarkable results of the inquiry was that the agricultural labor of England, as compared with other parts of the United Kingdom, is considerably the worst fed, as the appended table shows, quantities of carbon and nitrogen weekly consumed by an average agricultural adult. Dr. Hunter investigated cottages of agricultural laborers, not only in the purely agricultural districts, but in all counties of England. Of these, had only one bedroom, only two, and more than two. I will give a few specimens culled from a dozen counties. Bedfordshire, Wrestlingworth. Bedrooms about feet long and broad, although many are smaller than this. The small, one-storied cots are often divided by partitions into two bedrooms, one bed frequently in a kitchen, feet inches in height. Rent £1 a year. The tenants have to make their own privies, the landlord only supplies a hole. As soon as one has made a privy, it is made use of by the whole neighborhood. One house belonging to a family called Richardson was of quite unapproachable beauty. Its plaster walls bulged very like a lady's dress in a curtsy. One gable end was convex, the other concave, and on this last, unfortunately, stood the chimney, a curved tube of clay and wood like an elephant's trunk. A long stick served as prop to prevent the chimney from falling. The doorway and window were rhomboidal. Houses visited only had more than one bedroom, and those four overcrowded. The cots with one bedroom sheltered adults and children, a married couple with children, and Berkshire Bean. In June, a man, his wife and children lived in a cot. A daughter came home from service with scarlet fever. She died. One child sickened and died. The mother and one child were down with typhus when Dr. Hunter was called in. Father and one child slept outside, but the difficulty of securing isolation was seen here, for in the crowded market of the miserable village lay the linen of the fever-stricken household, waiting for the wash. The rent of H. house. A week, one bedroom for man, wife and children. One house let for a week, feet inches long, feet broad, kitchen feet high, the bedroom without window, fireplace, door or opening, except into the lobby, no garden. A man lived here for a little while, with two grown-up daughters and one grown-up son. Father and son slept on the bed, the girls in the passage. Each of the latter had a child while the family was living here, but one went to the workhouse for her confinement and then came home. Buckinghamshire cottages on acres of land contained here about person. The parish of Bradnam comprises acres. It numbered in houses and a population of males and females. This inequality of the sexes was partly remedied in, when they numbered males and females, increase in years of men and women. Meanwhile, the number of houses was one less. Winslow. Great part of this newly built in good style. Demand for houses appears very marked, since very miserable cots let at 2 per week. Water Eaton. Here the landlords, in view of the increasing population, have destroyed about % of the existing houses. A poor laborer who had to go about miles to his work answered the question whether he could not find a cot nearer. No, they know better than to take a man in with my large family. Tinker's End near Winslow. A bedroom in which were adults and children, feet long, feet broad, feet inches high at its highest part, another feet inches by feet inches high, sheltered person. Each of these families had less space than is considered necessary for a convict. No house had more than one bedroom, not one of them a back door, water very scarce, weekly rent from 2. And of the houses visited, only man that earned a week. The quantity of air for each person under the circumstances just described corresponds to that which he would have if he were shut up in a box of feet measuring each way, the whole night. Then, the ancient dens afforded a certain amount of unintentional ventilation. Cambridgeshire, Essex in this county, diminutions in the number of persons and of cottages go, in many parishes, hand in hand. In not less than parishes, however, the destruction of houses has not prevented increase of population, or has not brought about that expulsion which, under the name migration to towns, generally occurs. In Fingringhoe, a parish of acres were in houses in only. But the people did not wish to go away, and managed even to increase under these circumstances. In persons inhabited houses, but in persons were squeezed into houses. In Basildon Inn, persons lived on acres and houses. At the end of 10 years, persons in houses. In the parishes of Fingringhoe, South Fambridge, Widford, Basildon, and Ramsden Crags, in persons were living on acres and houses. In on the same area, persons in houses. Herefordshire, this little county, has suffered more from the eviction spirit than any other in England. At Nadby, overcrowded cottages generally, with only bedrooms, belonging for the most part to the farmers. They easily let them for £1 or £1 a year, and paid a weekly wage of. Huntingdon, Hartford had inn-houses shortly after this. Cottages were destroyed in this small parish of acres, population inn. Cottages, each with bedroom, were visited. In one, a married couple, grown-up sons, grown-up daughter, children, in all in another, adults' children. One of these rooms in which people slept was feet inches long, feet inches broad, feet inches high. The average, without making any deduction for projections into the apartment, gave about cubic feet per head. In the sleeping rooms, adults and children. These cottages are seldom provided with gardens, but many of the inmates are able to farm small allotments at, or per rood. These allotments are at a distance from the houses, which are without privy. The family must either go to the allotment to deposit their ordures, or, as happens in this place, saving your presence, use a closet with a trough set like a drawer in a chest of drawers, and drawn out weekly and conveyed to the allotment to be emptied where its contents were wanted. In Japan, the circle of life conditions moves more decently than this. Lincolnshire, Langtoft. A man lives here in Wright's house with his wife, her mother, and children. The house has a front kitchen, scullery, bedroom over the front kitchen and bedroom, feet inches by feet inches. The whole ground floor, feet inches by feet inches. The bedroom is a garret. The walls run together into the roof like a sugar loaf, a dormer window opening in front. Why did he live here? On account of the garden. No, it is very small. Rent, high, per week, near his work. No miles away, so that he walks daily to and fro mile. He lived there because it was a tenantable cot, and because he wanted to have a cot for himself alone, anywhere, at any price, and in any condition. The following are the statistics of houses in Langtoft, with bedrooms, adults, and children. 12 houses in Langtoft, Kent, Kennington, very seriously overpopulated when diphtheria appeared, and the parish doctor instituted a medical inquiry into the condition of the poorer classes. He found that in this locality, where much labor is employed, various cots had been destroyed and no new ones built. In one district stood 4 houses, named birdcages. Each had rooms of the following dimensions in feet and inches: Northamptonshire, Brinworth, Pickford, and Flor. In these villages in the winter, men were lounging about the streets from want of work. The farmers do not always till sufficiently the corn and turnip lands, and the landlord has found it best to throw all his farms together into. Hence want of employment. Whilst on one side of the wall, the land calls for labor, on the other side the defrauded laborers are casting at it longing glances. Feverishly overworked in summer, and half-starved in winter, it is no wonder if they say in their peculiar dialect, the parson and gentlefolk seem frit to death at them. At Flor, instances in one bedroom of the smallest size, of couples with children, adults with children, a couple with grandfather and children down with scarlet fever, and in 2 houses with 2 bedrooms, 2 families of and adults respectively. Wiltshire, Stratton. Houses visited with only 1 bedroom. Pentle, in the same parish, a cot let at it. Weekly with adults and children, had nothing good about it except the walls, from the floor of rough-hewn pieces of stones to the roof of worn-out thatch. Worcestershire, house destruction here not quite so excessive, yet from 2, the number of inhabitants to each house on the average has risen from 2 Batsy. Many cots and little gardens here. Some of the farmers declare that the cots are a great nuisance here, because they bring the poor. On the statement of one gentleman, the poor are none the better for them. If you build they will let fast enough. In fact, the more you build, the more they want. Dr. Hunter remarks, now these poor must come from somewhere, and as there is no particular attraction, such as doles at Batsy, it must be repulsion from some other unfit place, which will send them here. If each could find an allotment near his work, he would not prefer Batsy, where he pays for his scrap of ground twice as much as the farmer pays for his. The continual emigration to the towns, the continual formation of surplus population in the country through the concentration of farms, conversion of arable land into pasture, machinery, and the continual eviction of the agricultural population by the destruction of their cottages, go hand in hand. The more empty the district is of men, the greater is its relative surplus population, the greater is their pressure on the means of employment, the greater is the absolute excess of the agricultural population over the means for housing it, the greater, therefore, in the villages is the local surplus population and the most pestilential packing together of human beings. The packing together of knots of men in scattered little villages and small country towns corresponds to the forcible draining of men from the surface of the land. The continuous superseding of the agricultural laborers, in spite of their diminishing number and the increasing mass of their products, gives birth to their pauperism. Their pauperism is ultimately a motive to their eviction and the chief source of their miserable housing, which breaks down their last power of resistance and makes them more slaves of the landed proprietors and the farmer. Thus the minimum of wages becomes a law of nature to them. On the other hand, the land, in spite of its constant relative surplus population, is at the same time underpopulated. This is seen, not only locally at the points where the efflux of men to towns, mines, railroad making, and is most marked. It is to be seen everywhere, in harvest time as well as in spring and summer, at those frequently recurring times when English agriculture, so careful and intensive, wants extra hands. There are always too many agricultural laborers for the ordinary, and always too few for the exceptional or temporary needs of the cultivation of the soil. Hence we find in the official documents contradictory complaints from the same places of deficiency and excess of labor simultaneously. The temporary or local want of labor brings about no rise in wages, but a forcing of the women and children into the fields, and exploitation at an age constantly lower. As soon as the exploitation of the women and children takes place on a larger scale, it becomes in turn a new means of making a surplus population of the male agricultural laborer and of keeping down his wage. In the east of England thrives a beautiful fruit of this vicious circle, the so-called gang system, to which I must briefly return here. The gang system obtains almost exclusively in the counties of Lincoln, Huntingdon, Cambridge, Norfolk, Suffolk, and Nottingham, here and there in the neighboring counties of Northampton, Bedford, and Rutland. Lincolnshire will serve us as an example. A large part of this county is new land, marsh formerly, or even, as in others of the eastern counties just named, won lately from the sea. The steam engine has worked wonders in the way of drainage. What were once fens and sandbanks bear now a luxuriant sea of corn and the highest of rents. The same thing holds of the alluvial lands won by human endeavor, as in the island of Axholme and other parishes on the banks of the Trent. In proportion as the new farms arose, not only were no new cottages built, old ones were demolished, and the supply of labor had to come from open villages, miles away, by long roads that wound along the sides of the hills. There alone had the population formerly found shelter from the incessant floods of the wintertime. The laborers that dwell on the farms of acres are solely employed on such kinds of agricultural work as is permanent, difficult, and carried on by aid of horses. For every acres there is, on an average, scarcely one cottage. A fen farmer gave evidence before the Commission of Inquiry. I farm acres, all arable land. I have not one cottage on my farm. I have only one laborer on my farm now. I have 4 horsemen lodging about. We get light work done by gangs. The soil requires much light field labor, such as weeding, hoeing, certain processes of manuring, removing of stones, and this is done by the gangs or organized bands that dwell in the open villages. The gang consists of 2 or persons, women, young persons of both sexes, and children of both sexes. At the head is the gang master, always an ordinary agricultural laborer, generally what is called a bad lot, a scapegrace, unsteady, drunken, but with a dash of enterprise and savoir-faire. He is the recruiting sergeant for the gang, which works under him, not under the farmer. He generally arranges with the latter for piecework, and his income, which on the average is not very much above that of an ordinary agricultural laborer, depends almost entirely upon the dexterity with which he manages to extract within the shortest time the greatest possible amount of labor from his gang. The farmers have discovered that women work steadily only under the direction of men, but that women and children, once set going, impetuously spend their life force, as Fourier knew, while the adult male laborer is shrewd enough to economize his as much as he can. The gangmaster goes from one farm to another, and thus employs his gang from to months in the year. Employment by him is, therefore, much more lucrative and more certain for the laboring families than employment by the individual farmer, who only employs children occasionally. This circumstance so completely rivets his influence in the open villages that children are generally only to be hired through his instrumentality. The lending out of these individually, independently of the gang, is his second trade. The gang in its classical form just described is called the public, common, or tramping gang. For there are also private gangs. These are made up in the same way as the common gang, but count fewer members and work, not under a gang master, but under some old farm servant, whom the farmer does not know how to employ in any better way. The gypsy fund has vanished here, but according to all witnesses, the payment and treatment of the children is worse. The gang system, which during the last years has steadily increased, clearly does not exist for the sake of the gangmaster. It exists for the enrichment of the large farmers, and indirectly of the landlord. For the farmer there is no more ingenious method of keeping his laborers well below the normal level, and yet of always having an extra hand ready for extra work, of extracting the greatest possible amount of labor with the least possible amount of money, and of making adult male labor redundant. From the exposition already made, it will be understood why, on the one hand, a greater or less lack of employment for the agricultural laborer is admitted, while on the other, the gang system is at the same time declared necessary on account of the want of adult male labor and its migration to the towns. The cleanly weeded land and the uncleanly human weeds of Lincolnshire are pole and counterpole of capitalistic production. Ireland, in concluding this section, we must travel for a moment to Ireland. First, the main facts of the case. The population of Ireland had it had dwindled to 500,000, nearly to its level in. The diminution began with the famine year, so that Ireland, in less than 20 years, lost more than divided by ths of its people. Its total emigration from May to July numbered, the emigration during the years was more than 500,000. The number of inhabited houses fell from the number of holdings of to acres increased, that of holdings over acres, whilst the total number of all farms fell, a fall therefore solely due to the suppression of farms under acres, to their centralization. England, a country with fully developed capitalist production, and preeminently industrial, would have bled to death with such a drain of population as Ireland has suffered. But Ireland is at present only an agricultural district of England, marked off by a wide channel from the country to which it yields corn, wool, cattle, industrial and military recruits. The depopulation of Ireland has thrown much of the land out of cultivation, has greatly diminished the produce of the soil, and, in spite of the greater area devoted to cattle breeding, has brought about, in some of its branches, an absolute diminution in others, an advance scarcely worthy of mention, and constantly interrupted by retrogression. Nevertheless, with the fall in numbers of the population, rents and farmers' profits rose, although the latter not as steadily as the former. The reason of this is easily comprehensible. On the one hand, with the throwing of small holdings into large ones, and the change of arable into pasture land, a larger part of the whole produce was transformed into surplus produce. The surplus produce increased, although the total produce, of which it formed a fraction, decreased. On the other hand, the money value of this surplus produce increased yet more rapidly than its mass, in consequence of the rise in the English market price of meat, wool, and especially during the last years. The scattered means of production that serve the producers themselves as means of employment and of subsistence, without expanding their own value by the incorporation of the labor of others, are no more capital than a product consumed by its own producer is a commodity. If with the mass of the population, that of the means of production employed in agriculture also diminished, the mass of the capital employed in agriculture increased, because a part of the means of production that were formerly scattered was concentrated and turned into capital. The total capital of Ireland outside agriculture, employed in industry and trade, accumulated during the last 2 decades slowly, and with great and constantly recurring fluctuations, so much the more rapidly did the concentration of its individual constituents develop. And however small its absolute increase, in proportion to the dwindling population it had increased largely. The Irish famine have killed more than people, but it killed poor devils only. The wealth of the country it did not the slightest damage. The exodus of the next years, an exodus still constantly increasing, did not, as the 30 Years' War, decimate along with the human beings their means of production. Irish genius discovered an altogether new way of spiriting a poor people thousands of miles away from the scene of its misery. The exiles transplanted to the United States send home sums of money every year as traveling expenses for those left behind. Every troop that emigrates one year draws another after it the next. Thus, instead of costing Ireland anything, emigration forms one of the most lucrative branches of its export trade. Finally, it is a systematic process, which does not simply make a passing gap in the population, but sucks out of it every year more people than are replaced by the births, so that the absolute level of the population falls year by year. What were the consequences for the Irish labourers left behind and freed from the surplus population? That the relative surplus population is today as great as before, that wages are just as low, that the oppression of the labourers has increased, that misery is forcing the country towards a new crisis. The facts are simple. The revolution in agriculture has kept pace with immigration. The production of relative surplus population has more than kept pace with the absolute depopulation. A glance at Table C shows that the change of arable to pasture land must work, yet more acutely in Ireland than in England. In England, the cultivation of green crops increases with the breeding of cattle. In Ireland, it decreases. Whilst a large number of acres that were formerly tilled lie idle or are turned permanently into grassland, a great part of the waste land and peat bogs that were unused formerly become of service for the extension of cattle breeding. The smaller and medium farmers, I reckon among these all who do not cultivate more than acres, still make up about divided by HS of the whole number. They are one after the other, and with a degree of force unknown before, crushed by the competition of an agriculture managed by capital, and therefore they continually furnish new recruits to the class of wage laborers. The one great industry of Ireland, linen manufacture, requires relatively few adult men and only employs altogether, in spite of its expansion since the price of cotton rose in, a comparatively insignificant part of the population. Like all other great modern industries, it constantly produces, by incessant fluctuations, a relative surplus population within its own sphere, even with an absolute increase in the mass of human beings absorbed by it. The misery of the agricultural population forms the pedestal for gigantic shirt factories, whose armies of laborers are, for the most part, scattered over the country. Here, we encounter again the system described above of domestic industry, which in underpayment and overwork possesses its own systematic means for creating supernumerary labor. Finally, although the depopulation has not such destructive consequences as would result in a country with fully developed capitalistic production, it does not go on without constant reaction upon the home market. The gap which emigration causes here limits not only the local demand for labor, but also the incomes of small shopkeepers, artisans, tradespeople generally. Hence the diminution in incomes between pound and pound in Table E, a clear statement of the condition of the agricultural laborers in Ireland, is to be found in the reports of the Irish Poor Law Inspectors. Officials of a government which is maintained only by bayonets and by a state of siege, now open, now disguised, they have to observe all the precautions of language that their colleagues in England disdain. In spite of this, however, they do not let their government cradle itself in illusion. According to them, the rate of wages in the country, still very low, has within the last years risen %, and stands now on the average at 2 per week. But behind this apparent rise is hidden an actual fall in wages, for it does not correspond at all to the rise in price of the necessary means of subsistence that has taken place in the meantime. For proof, the following extract from the official accounts of an Irish workhouse. The price of the necessary means of subsistence is therefore fully twice, and that of clothing exactly twice, as much as they were years before. Even apart from this disproportion, the mere comparison of the rate of wages expressed in gold would give a result far from accurate. Before the famine, the great mass of agricultural wages were paid in kind, only the smallest part in money. Today, payment in money is the rule. From this it follows that, whatever the amount of the real wage, its money rate must rise. Previous to the famine, the laborer enjoyed his cabin, with a rood or half-acre or acre of land, and facilities for a crop of potatoes. He was able to rear his pig and keep fowl. But they now have to buy bread, and they have no refuse upon which they can feed a pig or fowl, and they have consequently no benefit from the sale of a pig, fowl, or eggs. In fact, formerly, the agricultural laborers were but the smallest of the small farmers, and formed for the most part a kind of rearguard of the medium and large farms on which they found employment. Only since the catastrophe have they begun to form a fraction of the class of purely wage laborers, a special class, connected with its wage masters only by monetary relation. We know what were the conditions of their dwellings in. Since then they have grown yet worse. A part of the agricultural laborers, which, however, grows less day by day, dwells still on the holdings of the farmers in overcrowded huts, whose hideousness far surpasses the worst that the English agricultural laborers offered us in this way. And this holds generally with the exception of certain tracts of Ulster, in the south in the counties of Cork, Limerick, Kilkenny, and in the east in Wicklow, Wexford, and in the centre of Ireland in Kings and Queens County, Dublin, and in the west in Sligo, Roscommon, Mayo, Galway, and the agricultural labourers' huts. An inspector cries out, are a disgrace to the Christianity and to the civilization of this country. In order to increase the attractions of these holes for the labourers, the pieces of land belonging thereto from time immemorial are systematically confiscated. The mere sense that they exist subject to this species of ban, on the part of the landlords and their agents, has given birth in the minds of the laborers to corresponding sentiments of antagonism and dissatisfaction towards those by whom they are thus led to regard themselves as being treated as a proscribed race. The first act of the agricultural revolution was to sweep away the huts situated on the field of labor. This was done on the largest scale, and as if in obedience to a command from on high. Thus many laborers were compelled to seek shelter in villages and towns. There they were thrown like refuse into garrets, holes, cellars, and corners, in the worst back slum. Thousands of Irish families, who according to the testimony of the English, eaten up as these are with national prejudice, are notable for their rare attachment to the domestic hearth, for their gaiety and the purity of their home life, found themselves suddenly transplanted into hotbeds of vice. The men are now obliged to seek work of the neighboring farmers and are only hired by the day, and therefore under the most precarious form of wage. Hence they sometimes have long distances to go to and from work, often get wet, and suffer much hardship, not unfrequently ending in sickness, disease, and want. These results of the agricultural revolution, the change of arable into pasture land, the use of machinery, the most rigorous economy of labor, and are still further aggravated by the model landlords, who, instead of spending their rents in other countries, condescend to live in Ireland on their domain. In order that the law of supply and demand may not be broken, these gentlemen draw their labor supply, chiefly from their small tenants, who are obliged to attend when required to do the landlord's work, at rates of wages, in many instances, considerably under the current rates paid to ordinary laborers, and without regard to the inconvenience or loss to the tenant of being obliged to neglect his own business at critical periods of sowing or reaping. The uncertainty and irregularity of employment, the constant return and long duration of gluts of labor, all these symptoms of a relative surplus population, figure therefore in the reports of the Poor Law Administration as so many hardships of the agricultural proletariat. It will be remembered that we met, in the English agricultural proletariat, with a similar spectacle. But the difference is that in England, an industrial country, the industrial reserve recruits itself from the country districts, whilst in Ireland, an agricultural country, the agricultural reserve recruits itself from the towns, the cities of refuge of the expelled agricultural laborer. In the former, the supernumeraries of agriculture are transformed into factory operatives. In the latter, those forced into the towns, whilst at the same time they press on the wages in towns, remain agricultural laborers and are constantly sent back to the country districts in search of work. Official inspectors sum up the material condition of the agricultural laborer as follows. Though living with the strictest frugality, his own wages are barely sufficient to provide food for an ordinary family and pay his rent, and he depends upon other sources for the means of clothing himself, his wife, and children. The atmosphere of these cabins, combined with the other privations they are subjected to, has made this class particularly susceptible to low fever and pulmonary consumption. After this, it is no wonder that, according to the unanimous testimony of the inspectors, a somber discontent runs through the ranks of this class, that they long for the return of the past, loathe the present, despair of the future, give themselves up to the evil influence of agitators, and have only one fixed idea, to emigrate to America. This is the land of Kilkenny, into which the great Malthusian panacea, depopulation, has transformed Green Erin. What a happy life the Irish factory operative leads one example will show. Such are Irish wages, such is Irish life. In fact, the misery of Ireland is again the topic of the day in England. At the end of and the beginning of, one of the Irish land magnates, Lord Dufferin, said about its solution in the time. Why menschlich von solch grossem Herrn. Centralization has from to destroyed principally farms of the first three categories, under and not over acre. These above all must disappear. This gives farmers and reckoning the families the low average of persons. On the extravagant supposition that, after the agricultural revolution is complete, 1/4 of these are again absorbable, there remain for emigration categories of over and not over acres are, as was known long since in England, too small for capitalistic cultivation of corn, and for sheep breeding are almost vanishing quantity. On the same supposition as before, therefore, there are further persons to emigrate total. And as El Appetit vient en manging, Rentroll's eyes will soon discover that Ireland, with 500,000, is still always miserable, and miserable because she is overpopulated. Therefore her depopulation must go yet further, that thus she may fulfill her true destiny, that of an English sheepwalk and cattle pasture. Like all good things in this bad world, this profitable method has its drawbacks. With the accumulation of rents in Ireland, the accumulation of the Irish in America keeps pace. The Irishman, banished by sheep and ox, reappears on the other side of the ocean as a Fenian, and face to face with the old queen of the seas rises, threatening and more threatening. The young giant republic, acerba fata Romanos agunt celusque fraterni nessus. In the crime of fratricide,